the artists, oh, awesome, recording is being, so this is being recorded. So if you feel like you don't want your face or your name in the recording, you can always turn off your screen. You can change your name too. Something else that we do is putting an L by your name if you're like, okay, I'm just here to listen. So these are all like some good consent for recording practices that I just wanted to bring in. So again, my name's Lucia. I use she, her, they, them, ella pronouns. And yeah, I'm one of the artists and one of the curators of this exhibition. I'm really excited to share all of the like incredibly thoughtful, deep, like kind of like soul searching work that has come through in this exhibition. And we're all going to be like chit-chatting about our work and sharing a little bit about ourselves. We're going to be starting with a water and land acknowledgement here. So I'll go ahead and go to the next slide so we can start reading.
We acknowledge that we are currently occupying the ancestral lands of the Council of Three Fires, Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi, as well as over a dozen tribes that call this land home, who have all known this land and water as a relative for millennia, and who remain our hosts on the land today.
We also name and see the vast, internationally unceded and stolen lands and water that undergird our access to this digital community. From the water that cools towers of electronics to the tubes traversing the bottom of the ocean, this ostensibly disembodied network actually demands great amounts of material resources to maintain.
In our land and water acknowledgement, we also want to state, see, and name that colonialism is a current ongoing process with such examples as the United States occupation of Hawaiian lands, whose inhabitants are currently fighting for the US Navy to acknowledge and repair the harm of the jet fuel leaking from the Red Hill storage facility into drinking water. Corporate projects to extract fossil fuels from the land, like Enbridge's Line 3 and Line 5, which directly harm Indigenous and non-Indigenous people by threatening Indigenous land sovereignty and the safety of everyone's drinking water. And our last example we've chosen of many possible is the ongoing conditions of gender-based violence and colonialism are demonstrated by the fact that Indigenous women and girls on Turtle Island continue to suffer incredibly high rates of sexual violence, trafficking, stalking, and battering and assault, most often perpetuated by non-Native offenders.
We further name that land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense. They function as recognizing and living celebrations of Indigenous communities. We stand with Native peoples in calling for a full rematriation of the land, a restoration and giving back of the land to its Indigenous stewards who possess the knowledge of being in right relationship with the land, spiritually and otherwise. We stand for a decolonial future, which includes full reparations for harm done to Native peoples.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us as we do this important due diligence and this important first step towards a much larger project of rematriation and reparation to the Indigenous people of this land, and also want to call in and name the descendants of enslaved Africans who were stolen and brought to do free labor for this land as well. Having set this foundation, we're going to go ahead and transition into telling you a little bit more about ourselves and our practices. So here we're going to go from left to right. This is a really cute picture that was taken on the show opening. Thank you so much for being there. If you were, if you weren't, that is totally okay. The show will be up until March 13th, and we would love to still just, have your presence, have your energy, have your sight on our works, and hear what you think. So go ahead, Olive.
Hi, everyone. My name is Olive Stefanski. I use she, her, or they, them pronouns. Either one is good by me. I am a queer, Jewish, non-binary artist whose practice is about devotion. My understanding of devotion was fostered through studying Jewish texts from a feminist, queer, and mystical lens. And within my studio practice, the laborious processes of weaving, spinning, and dyeing become practices through which I reckon with both the existential reality of time and also commune with the sacred and the mysterious and the unknown.
Thanks, Olive. Hi, everyone. My name is Abena Motaboli, pronoun she, her. I'm an interdisciplinary visual artist, educator, and writer, originally from Lesotho, which is a tiny country in the middle of South Africa, but I am Chicago-based. My practice is interdisciplinary, it's performative, it is very experimental. I'm inspired by my connection to land through my immigrant experience and the connections that we all have to our native lands or homelands. I'm also really interested in deeply listening to plants, collaborating with them, with water, and connecting back to my culture through our living world and through the visual arts. And I'll pass that to Lucia.
Abena, that's so beautiful. I was just absorbing it as you were saying it. So I'll go ahead and read a little bit of what I wrote here. My name's Lucia. Like I said, I use she, her, they, them, aya pronouns. I'm a fiber artist and art educator from the American South, raised by South Americans. I'm interested in boundaries of identity, abject self-portraits inspired by deep sea creatures, emotional blobs, and somatic vulnerability. So I really see my practice as kind of like this site of so many questions that I have about the world and about my place in it, and using kind of inspirations from the natural world to help me express how I'm feeling. I'll pass to Ryn. Ryn, you're on mute.
Ryn, can you hear us? You're on mute.
Oh, such a classic Ryn move. I'm like the worst with technology for being a millennial. So my name's Ryn. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a Chicago-based artist and educator. In my work, I confront and express complex and intimate emotions through a very intuitive, movement-driven cyanotype process. And I just want to give a shout out to my mom and my grandma, who I just saw pop up on the screen. Hi. So just to give a little bit of overview of the structure of our talk, it will be more conversational in nature and more flowing and meandering. We've come up with questions that we'd like to ask each other, just to show a little bit too about how we've developed really close relationships as artists. And Abena is going to start us off with our first question.
Thank you, Ryn. So my first question is for Lucia. I'm curious about your connection to water, land, and body, and sort of like, how do you see those together? And
Wow.
also, pull up the next slide with your work on it.
Totally. I'm going to go to the next slide here. Boop. All right, now we're going to start looking at art, y'all. Very excited for that part. Wow, I'm feeling a little bit giddy because that is like such a big, beautiful, robust question, and very grateful that something that I did was writing my thoughts down instead of just like trusting the brain to be lucid and linear. So I'll go ahead and read from this little text that I wrote. So starting with inspiration, I'm obsessed, fascinated, and deeply inspired by the deep sea and its ebb and flow. Every day and night, one of Earth's largest migrations happens when animals of the deep move closer to the moonlight to mate, eat, die, and fall back down into the fertile detritus crust of the ocean floor. There's something called marine snow that falls from the sunlight layers into the eyeless deep, particles of bodies that will be recycled into nourishment by bottom dwellers and will then return to the upper world through this nightly migration. I look to this fascination and observation of ocean relationships to help form the emergent logic of my collages. So this is one of these collages. In the exhibition, there's this huge one, and there's many smaller ones also. And so they all kind of relate to this, this logic that I'm going to talk about here. These collages are largely intuitive explorations of color, shape, and line. But when I want to ask myself, why this, not that, like, what should I put here instead of here? And why does it go there instead of over there? And then like my next step needs a reason. I think about the deep sea. I think about the movement of particles and energy. I think about how eyeless denizens cluster on seamounts, how rocks and other animals floating through the benthic become anchors in the vastness of the ocean. And this ocean inspiration is also guiding the evolution of my soft sculptures. So now I'm about to scoot over to the next pieces. All right, these are also two pieces that are shown at the show, and I would love to, hear y'all's experiences with them too. So on the left, you can see an early work called Poroteratoma 1. The name Poroteratoma comes from two things: poro, meaning porous, relating to the puckered and ruched nature of the surface. Teratoma is a medical term for an aberrant growth, usually relating to some kind of secret, sneaky twin that is formed alongside the development of a main fetus. So I'm combining these ideas in the title here. So here I can briefly touch on questions of land and body too. I think that my connection to land is better characterized by displacement, this natal sense of being ni de aquí, ni de allá. My parents raised me to be very proud of my Peruvian heritage, but I also feel very estranged by virtue of being born and raised in a whitewashed culture. I also feel estranged from land here in the so-called United States, but that's more because I haven't dedicated the time, energy, and care that I think really walking with and learning this land really deserves. So my relationship to land is still something that I'm growing and learning, and it's actually deepening as I grow my relationship to my own body. Body is much closer to me. My body has been a tenacious and contested home. So many cultural frames and systems of oppression are focused on my body. My body is racialized, my body is fat, my body is femme, and chronically ill. And I'm trying to address the emotional experience of it through these sculptures, but largely the first sculpture as well. The layers of puckered and semi-permeable fabric relate to inflammation, healing, letting some things in, and also refusing to grow a thicker skin to numb myself against the world. This early sculpture is from 2016, 2017, and it's continuing to evolve. So on the right, I'm going to talk a little bit about how inner child metaphysical came about and loop it back into a question about water. So I really think that vulnerability and a relationship to the body of the viewer is something that I want to explore in the presentation of my artwork. Unfortunately, in the past, I've kind of had unpleasant experiences where the specific agreements that I wanted to put forth for people to interact with my work were not really being respected or upheld. So, for example, the piece on the right, Poroteratoma 1, I noticed a lot of people really probing and prying and sticking their fingers in there in a very invasive and just a way that didn't represent the care that I wanted it to be touched with. And so that made me really think about, okay, well, if touch is really important to my work, but the audience isn't always going to come at my work with the same intention as I want them to, how can I do that? And so that's where I got the idea for these tentacles. It was if the human touch is a little bit too intense and invasive for these artworks, they need to have a way for them to touch the world around them and to be able to touch each other. Let's see. So the other thing about them is, now thinking more about inner child metaphysical, some areas are more in this hurt and bruised and very purple and puckered kind of situation, whereas the areas that have the tentacles kind of represent something that it hasn't been kind of hurt or intervened upon yet. Because I am thinking a lot about how in a trauma response, a lot of times the place that you're feeling the most hurt isn't the place that you can also go to reach out to other people. So thinking about how embodied trauma can be materialized through these really vulnerable and soft and squishy sculptures. So thinking about water, I also kind of realized that the connection between the sculptures and the collages that I was making is the logic of the undersea. because I had been working on the collages and the sculptures kind of like separately, but they were like adjacent. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. These things are both happening at the same time. What's really their connection? And just, after hours and hours of watching Monterey Bay Aquarium footage, I was like, oh, so what if I just think about these sculptures as living organisms that inhabit the world that I'm creating through my collages? And the collages are kind of like a glimpse into this other world where they might live. And so the collages are what I'm calling these glimpses into a place called the gloop and droop dimension, where everything's like really floppy and soft and squishy and very tender and vulnerable. And as I'm trying to like kind of think of the logic of what that world is like, I'm going back to like, okay, well, how do they do it in the deep sea? How do they do it in the deep sea? And the other thing I really love about the deep sea is that I think it's very poetically related to the unconscious mind. The ocean holds so much unknown and so much turbulence and so many beautiful relationships. And it just makes me think of like all of the things that I don't know yet about my own mind or my own body. So yeah, so I wrote a summary sentence to summarize. My connection to land is through displacement and curiosity. My connection to body is deeply psychologically fundamental. And my connection to water is a source of fascination, inspiration, and logic for some next steps that I want to take in my studio practice. All right, so I think I'm going to ask Abena the next question. However, I'm not sure what that question was. Can someone jump in for me and ask Abena the question?
Yeah, I got it.
Thank you.
Abena, how does your lived experience as an immigrant relate to your understanding of water and ephemeral materials, especially in your tea pieces?
Ooh, thank you for that, Ryn. Also, Lucia, your answer was really beautiful. And if you're looking at Ryn's screen, Ryn is in the gallery, so you can see some pieces right behind her. Oh my gosh, that's a huge question. I feel like this idea of immigration and home is something every immigrant is constantly thinking about. Where is home? What is home? What does that even mean? How do you even come back to an answer? Is that a conclusive answer, So I think about like this idea of immigration as something that is very fluid. Everything about my practice is incredibly fluid. And so on screen, you'll see two images. The one on the left is an ongoing collaboration with my plant allies. And those are all botanically dyed fabrics using different plants. This piece is not complete. It is in progress. But that is a piece I started at my most recent residency with the weaving mill. And I just used their plants in their dye garden. Over the course of 6 weeks, I got to know about the plants, as I really love plants, love nature. And then the image on the right is part of a larger series of 6. And those are around 25 inches by 30 inches, and they are tea pieces. They're part of a series I like to call residual residue. So sort of thinking about residue, thinking about the things that are left behind, the stains that are left while you try and figure out what's on top of that. And then the individual titles for those are Stains in Me and Stains in Us. And so these pieces are made with tea, they're made with coffee, they're made with natural coffee inks. I'm really interested in exploring natural material as a medium, but also as a way to connect back home. And I think like my use of tea and coffee it literally is just something I started using 10 years ago when I moved here. And I started using it because I love tea. I'm obsessed with tea. I'm obsessed with coffee and the way it smells. And I was just like really looking for something that would connect me back home. And all I could think of as I was painting and not really enjoying like the textures of like oil and acrylic paint was, here's this thing that reminds me of home, and that's tea and that is coffee. And so I really feel like it was very organic, thinking about something that reminded me of home, something that made me feel warm, something that made me feel loved. And And then just thinking about it as a medium, anytime I meet someone, we're having a cup of tea and we're sharing stories, or we're having a cup of coffee and we're sharing stories. So there's this really huge idea of like ritual and being together. And like I have my tea right now and we're having a conversation. So I think for me, it's just this idea of like strong connection to home, and also this idea of community. And then the part that I love is where I get to be in my studio exploring tea as a medium. But something that's also really been fascinating for me using plants as a medium is I feel like plants really reveal themselves to you in their own time. And so after using tea for like 5 years, I just sort of started digging further behind where does this tea come from? And it made me think a lot about the history of colonialism, where I come from. And there's a lot of things in our culture that don't belong to us. So tea and coffee, for example, tea being one that comes through the Brits, that comes through India, that comes through China. And in that way, you're sort of able to trace the route of history by reading the land and reading the plants. So that's something that's been really important to me, just exploring as a medium and also just conceptually. Wow, there's so much. Lucia, you can change to the next slide.
Cool.
I'll briefly touch on this one. I've been doing a lot of botanical dyeing of late, and I started this a few years ago just as a way to find more connection to the plants in Illinois. I'm really interested in connecting to wherever your current home is. So my current home right now is Chicago. So I'm interested about learning about the plants here and how I can connect to them. And that's in the form of botanically dyeing these pieces of fabrics. So this is a piece that's in the gallery. It's made up of different plants. The orange ones are made with marigolds. There is eucalyptus in there, coccinea, which is a little bug. There's like sunflower leaves, different parts of flowers that I feel very connected to over here. And I'm interested in thinking about these as sculptures, but also as wearable art. So a lot of these scarves or like items that you can put on your body or dance with or interact with in different ways. And that sort of bleeds its way back to the fluidity of like water. And I think something everyone will touch on too is just this, how important water is to all of our practices. Dyeing is incredibly extensive. It is laborious. It takes a lot of time, and there's a lot of use of water and liquid. So that's that. My mom also sewed growing up, so I was always surrounded by fabric, which is something that I keep coming back to. There are a lot of plants and fabrics and beautiful correlations that were around me in my childhood that I'm returning to unknowingly through exploration and art. And with that, I will pass it on to Olive with the next question. So Olive, I'm curious about your connection to ancestry and portals as a form of transformation. So how are the texts you explore alongside your work a part of that? And I guess we can move to the next slide.
Yeah. Let me scoot up. There we go.
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Abena, for that wonderful question. I also prepared some thoughts to share just in relationship to the works that are in the show and about my practice at large. So I think really when it comes to ancestry, I really consider my spiritual lineage in my work. My studio really centers a love for the beauty of Jewish wisdom. And I see that wisdom as a process that is constantly becoming. The symbols that I study within Jewish cultural and textual archives are living and constantly transforming and multitudinous. So I really believe that through creating my artwork with these references, I reassert these ideas as worthy of meaning making and as sources of beauty and peace that become available to be communally received by the viewers and the public when they're in space. And I think in terms of Abena's question about portals, I think that time and text are two portals that I enter and re-enter in my practice. And I study quite a lot in my life and as a result of my artist practice. Specifically, I have been focusing on Jewish ideas about creation and how they show up in a variety of different texts throughout Jewish history, starting with the book of Bereshit in the Torah, traveling to a mystical text about the creation of the universe called Sefer Yetzirah. And recently I've started to read a book called Genesis Rabbah, which is a Talmudic era commentary by the rabbis on Jewish creation mythologies in Genesis. So it's a commentary on what has already been written, and then it's being expanded upon and reinterpreted. So I consider, when I say Torah, I'm not only talking about the 5 books of Moses, but I'm talking about all of Jewish teachings and all of Jewish wisdom. So I really explore Torah very deeply within my practice. And this piece right here, Void Mother Tehom, is a really good example of just the research and work I've created on the topic of Jewish creation cosmologies since like 2019. I started making this weaving in 2020. And it's one of the largest weavings and indigo dyed works that I've ever made. The cloth is hand woven, and it's 7.5 feet wide and 30 inches long, just to give you an idea of the scale. And so the dye process to achieve also a cloth of this size in natural indigo took me about a year of devoting myself to continuing to dye the cloth in the vat. So Tehom, the reference in the title, is a reference to a primordial life-generating abyss of water, which is present before all of creation in one Jewish creation cosmology. The Shekhinah, which is the feminine indwelling presence of the divine that exists in all of living creation, first appears in Jewish spiritual texts as the breath of the living God, which hovers over the Tehom at the beginning of time. So it's a very, just an incredibly beautiful image to consider. And I also, as I'm writing, I'm like, oh, the beginning of time. I really think of time as being kind of cyclical and nonlinear. So I say that with the understanding that that's not, we're not talking about a line, we're talking about a circle, or maybe many, many circles. So I think maybe a good transition, although there isn't a photo of it in our PowerPoint, but I think it's very related to this work, is my work weaving hollow sculptural vessels out of basketry materials like reed, which I then dye in indigo also upon their creation. So each woven form is unique. Oh, Ryn is, thank you, Ryn, showing one of them. Thank you so much. They're drawn and I intuitively shape them with water and my hands. So I'm hoping to eventually create a series of 10 of them that will be shown all together, which are inspired by some Jewish teachings which concern the 10 Sephirot, which are these hollow dimensions of the universe that kind of comprise this architectural frame for creation. So the dimensional forms have explored undulation as a kind of unifying formal quality that they have. So each is both kind of rotund and nimble in their composition. And I also believe them to be sort of a contribution to sculpture from the perspective of weaving and interlacement. I make them as forms to sort of communicate these ideas and consider these ideas not to be used as a functional object. And thus far, I've made 5 of the 10 and will be continuing to work on them. And their titles have largely been references to the Sephirot or the process of creation that I've read about in Sefer Yetzirah. So the basket that you can see right here is titled What the Mouth Cannot Say and the Ear Cannot Hear, which is a reference to, a very poetic reference to sort of infinity that it appears in Sefer Yetzirah. Lucia, can you go to the next slide, please? So I'll sort of wrap this question up with just talking about this artwork when it relates to the question of ancestral work and portals. I believe that when it comes to ancestral work for myself as a person, I receive this information sort of intuitively and often through intense dreams. So I received a dream throughout my life repeatedly for 10 years that I was attempting to try to figure out and ascertain how I might intervene in the dream's need and how I could heal whatever burden the dream was communicating to me. Throughout my life, I've often found myself placed into metaphysical circumstances that I think that I need to, within my work, I often need to deal with the fact that that's a reality within my life. And so I bring that to my work. And this weaving was an inspiration based on doing that work with this recurring dream. And it was the beginning of this kind of formal exploration of tapestry, working improvisationally and also considering what it would mean to create intentional holes and slits and ruptures in the structure while still having the work be structurally sound at the same time. And the last thing I'll say before I pass on the next question is that I do believe that ancestral work is very crucial work for the political liberation of our world at this moment in time. So I also bring that analysis to what I think about when I'm doing this kind of practice.
Thank you for that, Olive. Really like rich material. So the next question is for Ryn. How does transformation take place within your work, and how is that related to your sense of self?
Thanks, Abena.
Ryn, is this the right image for your ideas?
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome.
So transformation is a large part of my process. My works are cyanotypes, even though at first a lot of folks think they're either works on paper with paint or ink. So to make my prints, I use cyanotype chemical and a brush, and I make abstract marks on paper. And when I make larger scale work, like the piece in our slideshow, I lay out the paper on my floor and I'm able to extend my body over it and release a lot of emotion and tension that I hold in my body onto the paper. So once the mark making happens, the paper and chemical is exposed to sunlight. Usually it sits for a few days and then I rinse it with water in my bathtub. And the rinsing of water changes the chemical to a dark blue. So the paper itself changes too. It becomes wrinkled and it bellows. Sometimes it tears, and the chemical changes when it interacts with both sunlight and water. So that's kind of how the transformation takes place within the process of my work. And then my work itself is about process and transformation in the self through social and emotional experiences. So I often reflect on these emotions while I'm working in this transformation-based and intuitive cyanotype process, and it becomes very meditative for me. And this particular piece is a self-expression of recently feeling a new power and the ability to express myself more fully and authentically. So sometimes these abstract images that I make take on a very loose figure shape, and I tend to like literally express myself through the creation of those figures. Yeah, thanks, Abena.
Yeah, could you also just touch on the scale and how performative these pieces are? Because I feel like just knowing you and your process, some of these are really large and they're very vulnerable pieces.
Yeah, I think just one note about the scale, I started moving into much larger work when I literally felt like me as a person was ready to take up more space in the world. So it was a feeling of I have a lot to say, I have a lot of emotion within me, and I need a lot more space to express it. So that was how I moved from smaller scale work to larger scale work. And I don't know, the process, like you can picture I'm in a studio apartment, literally like wrestling with paper at some points because it comes as a roll and you unroll it and flatten it, and then lifting it, putting it underwater, like carrying it out of my bathtub, laying it onto my floor. So there is a little bit of labor there, and in all of that just movement, there's a lot of just like emotional release that happens too.
Thank you for that. I think the next question was Lucia, but can you still not see your screen?
Yeah, I'm gonna have to really rely on y'all to to jump in for me because I can just see the PowerPoint.
Okay, cool. I'll go for it. So this is also for Ryn, and this is something I'm curious about too. I'm curious about your emotional experience as you work with, collaborate, and construct your artwork, because there is so much in that.
Yeah, I can get into that a little bit more. I think when I'm making a print, it's also a very reflective experience. It's a way I allow myself to feel and express emotions that are sometimes in contrast with each other, or just like really hard or like really heavy. Like the kinds of feelings that we have that we don't quite always know what to do with. So I don't work with an end image in mind. It's very intuitive. And like I said, a lot of the time a very abstract figure emerges, which I kind of see as myself or a person.
Good. I'm back
going
in.
through.
Okay, I'm going to listen a little longer. Not much.
Going through an emotional experience like conflict or fear. And then the tension in a lot of my work represents the fear I think a lot of people can relate to of being with ourselves and feeling our more difficult emotions, as well as a personal fear I've been working through of being fully seen and expressing my needs at the risk of being misunderstood or seen as burdensome. But I also don't like to tell too specific stories about any of my work because I want the work to be open to the viewer to project or reflect on whatever experience or emotions they might be holding on to. And I'm actually in the gallery, so I'm going to get closer real quickly to the piece in the image. Okay, there. Nope, there. So this piece is called Tension and Relief. And there's a figure here that's attempting to grow or find relief. But it's very delicately stifled by this dark, ominous and heavy shape. And this piece is meant to express the tension of wanting to express a need, but again, like fearing rejection or misunderstanding in expressing a feeling or a need. Yeah, thank you for the question, Abena. I really appreciate being able to share this with you all. And then I believe, yeah, I'm the next question. And my question is for Olive. Olive, does your process of making and weaving relate to transformation? Similarly to like myself and my process and how it relates to transformation.
Thank you for this question, Ryn. It was really nice to consider really what I do think about that an idea and to get to write about weaving a little bit. So I'll share some of my thoughts. My first immediate thought when Ryn asked me this question was considering that the process of weaving in certain ways feels related to Jewish mystical ideas, in the sense that one cloth is comprised of the many. There's many threads that comprise the whole. The one comprises the many, and the many comprises the whole. For me, I think that these ideas are very fundamentally about transformation. But weaving, as I have come to understand it after practicing it since, I would say, I started to learn in 2017, I believe it is not fundamentally or inherently anything. To me, it's both kind of nothingness and infinity at the same time. However, I do think that the practice of weaving is always informed and impacted by history, politics, the weaver's own ancestry and identity, and the conceptual intentions of the weaver themselves to define what it means to weave. And I would say that right now my practice explores both the possibilities, very transcendent possibilities, and the boundaries and limitations of the practice of weaving. I do believe that's something I've been contemplating lately, is that sometimes the point of doing something is to sort of do it, even when you aren't entirely sure of what the point is. And I believe this to be a spiritual truth that I've followed on my path through my studio work. I believe that time is a very potent energetic force field that weavers can drop into and become very acutely aware of. And I think this gives us an opportunity to consider time as a way of receiving healing and to understand it through a basis of love. The artist and weaver Ani Albers once said that her weavings are not about anything in particular, but that they deal with considerations that one has when they are alone. And while I would say perhaps not all weavers are completely alone as they weave, but I do believe that when you weave, you are confronted with yourself over and over again. And for me, being an artist is a spiritual path, and one that is very intimately connected to having the courage to continue to return both to my studio and to the loom. And the notion of returning as related to transformation is also one that I relate to Jewish teachings. There is a notion of a concept called teshuvah, which is a big concept, but I'll sort of briefly sum it up as a word that describes both the process of transformation and transformation itself. It references a returning back to the source, and also is a method of making right of what was previously misaligned. So I've been trying to really describe weaving that is not time consuming or laborious, because I feel that there's some limitations in this language around like how one's time should be spent, or that weaving somehow takes too much time. But I think that that really is such a subjective idea. And for me, the labor and time that I give to weaving is really from a place of love, and it's grounded in Jewish art historical traditions where kind of elaborately laborious creation is done as this indication of devotion to infinity. So I will wrap up this sort of manifesto about weaving that I've been able to share with you all by speaking about this particular piece next to the slide here called Piercing the Firmament. It's a tapestry made of hand-spun and indigo dyed yarn. It was the 7th work that I made for my solo show, which was titled "And Before One, What Are You Counting?" So that show was 7 textiles and sculptural vessels that were inspired by Jewish creation cosmologies and the architecture of the universe. And I created it in response to the other blue tapestry that we saw earlier in the presentation. So to be made in the same fashion and kind of with the same rules as I gave myself for working with that tapestry, which is to work with blue and to create intentional slits and holes in the structure through improvisation. So So as I began to make Piercing the Firmament, I started to think about the Hebrew word for heaven, which is Shemayim, which kind of loosely translates to sky water. And there are cosmologies surrounding the sky as being created when the water was separated from, the water above was separated from the water below. And some interpretations of this notion were that the firmament was kind of this dome that sealed and held the above water in place. And there are also some teachings that new firmaments are created when someone creates a new interpretation of Torah. So for me, I think this is really cool and kind of continues to expand the symbol of the firmament. And so I began to think about like what it means to pierce it, like creating these holes. And I think it's kind of this, considering all of this in mind, it's a little bit of an act of chaos of like releasing the sealed dome. But also I think it's a way of witnessing the reality of rupture, which I think is what my work in these two pieces is really trying to witness and soothe. So thank you very much. Let me see here. It's actually, Abena, do you want me to ask you this question? Do you want to speak more about your natural dye process, or do you feel you've said all that?
I feel like I've said enough about that. I can talk a little bit about the writing pieces or about water. I really love what you're saying, Olive, about this returning to and all of these portals. So beautiful. Yeah, so in the show, we don't have any pictures on the slide, but I do have some writing work included in the exhibition, and these are just really intimate small poems. And a lot of them are on the theme of water. I've been doing this series where I go to the lake a lot, and every time I'm at the lake, I'll write a poem, a gratitude poem to the water, or about the water, or for the water, just as my way of connecting to water. And so I think of these as like writing collaborations with parts of nature, and this idea that water is us, and like we are water. It is in our body, it is our body. So I feel like we're just all so connected to water as human beings, water and land. But also like being in Chicago, it is such a form of solace. It is such a form of respite and calm in this big, beautiful body. I'm looking at the time and I realize we're super short on time. There is one more question for Lucia. I'm not too sure if we wanted to do that. And I'll go ahead and ask that. Lucia, maybe you can pick what you want to talk about, but tell us a bit more about your work's relationship to sea creatures or skin, two themes you've been engaging with for years.
Cool. I'll give you like a thesis book in 3 minutes, so we have time for our last little activity. There we go. This is the right slide. So welcome back to my little sculpture. Her name is Inner Child, Metiviosa. And I'm going to talk a little bit about, let's see, felt and organza and materials and like where these choices come from. Let's see. Yeah, let's just start there. Let's start very concrete. So felt is a really cool process to me, and it's very related to water because I use wet felting to create the interior kind of, the interior layer of these sculptures. And then in some cases, let me see if I can use this laser. Yeah. All right. So in some cases, you can kind of see where the felt is kind of peeking through the organza. And this is just to sort of represent like areas that are a little bit more bubbled and puckered, kind of like a blister, like when you have a blister that's just like bubbled and puckered. And I kind of want areas of the interior to be more visible in the places that are more related to surface and more related to these places where the object is actually directly interacting with the surface. So these tentacles are the way for the interior to become extruded outward. Kind of like there's an animal called a sea cucumber that one of their defense mechanisms is evisceration. Evisceration literally means that the sea cucumber will spurt out its GI tract, its guts, as a way of fending off predators. So I think it's That's not exactly what's happening here, but it's definitely one of the references that I'm looking at. Whereas other areas of this creature are not tentacled, and they're more like dealing with the aftermath of having been hurt in some way. I started to use organza because one summer I volunteered in a lab, and my job was to wash the red blood cells from little mice hearts. And the tissue of the mice heart, when it's devoid of red blood cells, just reminded me very much of organza. And I really like that organza can be heat manipulated. I like that it's very pliable, but I like that it also holds its shape. So there's a flexibility and resilience and structure to it. I also really love the transparency of it, because I think that I'm just very fascinated by transparency and overlaying things on top of each other. I'm also trying to think about like the different layers of skin, having like your surface, your interior, and your bottom layer of skin. And even thinking back to like in embryology, the human embryo develops with different layers of, I think, like endoderm, mesoderm, and ectoderm, if I'm not mistaken. But that basically these different layers of germ cells, like the cool thing is that like the germ cells that become your brain and that become your skin all start in the same layer of the embryo. So all of that is kind of collapsed and I want to say confluenced and like kind of connected poetically into this choice to use like the many layers of organza. I think that felt is a more recent process that I'm using in my studio, because I just love material exploration. And let's see, yeah, noting the time. It is something that I think of as a very cute process. Like I think about like little needle felted animals. I think about the felt that was used to cover Kermit the Frog, one of the first Muppets. And I really like taking something that is just like very cute and again, also very pliable, very structural, and kind of pushing it towards a gross place. Because I love playing with like that, like that I want people to look at these pieces and be like intrigued, but maybe a little bit grossed out, like once you start to spend more time with them and know more about them. And I also think, I was talking to a friend of mine about like just using the phrase like, oh, I felt it, everything. And they're like, wow, you really do feel everything, don't you? And I was like, I do, don't I? So felt is like this really poetic like conflation of like a psychological experience and a physical experience. And it just allows me to express like how much I'm interested in the skin as this site of sublimation of psychological information and projection of kind of like I was mentioning these systems of oppression projected onto my body and kind of landing on my skin as one of those sites where they really like grab hold. Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Abena, and thank you for letting me have some time to like delve into it. I'm seeing some questions here. I'm seeing a wonderful question from someone asking how we arrived at Confluence as the title of the overall exhibition. I wonder if anyone wants to take a turn responding to that.
Well, I feel that one thing that I remember when someone suggested the title was kind of the reference to confluence, the definition of confluence being where multiple bodies of water sort of meet at a particular point. So like where the river flows into the sea, or something else like that, for an example. And I think that the curatorial premise of kind of bringing everyone together to sort of address how water is a part of our various practices. I think that that was also a way to kind of, sorry, the train is going by behind me. One of the ways to also kind of like conceptually and poetically also tie together the fact that we each were working with themes around water for reasons that went beyond its like specific, I would say, like just its materiality of itself. Like there's other things that we're bringing into our understandings of it that I think we were hoping to convey through the title.
Yeah, I would also just add like confluence as like a process of merging. I feel like that happens a lot for all of us in different ways. Like in my work, I feel like I'm merging a feeling of wanting relief, but also holding myself back at times. And then I also feel, or I also see merging happening a lot in our processes, like in creating things with fiber and with weaving, you're like merging things together. So that's a part of it too. Thanks for your question, Kathleen.
Yeah, and I think I wanted to add to that Confluence really bore out in the way that the show ended up being curated in space, in that there's a lot of connection and flow between everybody's pieces together versus things being very discrete and separate. So I think that Confluence was a good way to say there's energy, there's movement, there's connection, and merging of just a lot of different ideas all at once too. Abena, was there anything you would like to add before we go to the lovely writing activity?
No, I think you guys said it pretty well. There's just so much transformation and working through emotions and feelings and connections through the show, and even the way that it came about was so fluid. So I feel like we're all just so interconnected by water and that constant motion and movement, which leads us to our final activity for the talk. So I know we don't have time for this. Feel free to take a screenshot, but I just wanted to do a quick breath with you and then leave you with 2 prompts to think or journal about in your own time. So I wanted us to all take a breath in and let it out. Maybe wiggle if you feel like wiggling. Stretch if you need a stretch. You are water. You are transformation. Water is transformation. Water is you. Feel free to breathe in again and breathe out. And then we just wanted to leave you with 2 prompts to think about. The first one is, what is your first memory with water or of water? And the second is, where has water been a collaborator in your life, whatever that means? So maybe feel free to think on those, take it as a journaling prompt, maybe get back to over your morning tea tomorrow or coffee. And yeah, we just wanted to say thank you so much again for joining. Francine, I don't know if you want to say anything about Heaven Hours. Please do follow us on our Instagrams at Abena Art, LCA Studio, Diario, Floaty Plays, and Rinse Prints.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been such an engaging, such an inspiring, and such a healing talk. It's so wonderful to hear more about your work, especially because experiencing it in the space is so special. We do have hours today from 1 to 5. We're open every week, Friday, Saturday, 1 to 6, and again, Sunday, 1 to 5. So for anyone here at this talk who hasn't been able to come in person, it will be up for a number more of weeks. So we hope to see you in the space. And again, thank you so much to all of the artists for sharing your work and your time and talent with us. Do you want to say anything?
Thank you to all the artists and everyone who came and listened in. Come visit us. We love you.
We do. We really love you. It's so great to work with all of you. You bring such an amazing energy. And I think that the themes that you're working through in your art really are felt in the way you interact with each other, and have so much honor for just your practice and each other. It's so wonderful to see. So thank you. How special. Truly. So we'll have this talk recorded. It's going to be up on our Instagram bio, on our YouTube, and our website by the end of the day. So if you want to return to this and meditate more on anything we've talked about or share it with people who couldn't join, please do so. Such a great talk. And I hope everyone has a really great rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you all so much, everybody. Thank you for your time and your energy and making the effort to be here at this time too. It's really meaningful to have so many loving people here to hear our like very vulnerable truths.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.